thank you very much for joining us this morning, and welcome to Espresso Briefs. I have my colleagues, Marilla Govender and Abias Ngwenya, who are the clever people within our organization. They are our two in-house economists, and they will be sharing some of the questions with me this morning. But let me kick off, and can we talk a little bit about your background and your very varied career? And when I was preparing for the call, I was struck by how varied your career has been. I wasn't aware, for example, that you had run a power station at Eskom at one point in your career. You had been a lecturer in maths and science. You had been the chief executive officer of Alexander Forbes. You had worked at SARS previously. I think you set up the large business organization at SARS during the early period of your career. And then you returned to run SARS. And some may say that, it's quite a non-linear career path. But the one thing that struck me when I was looking at the various elements of your career was the element of precision. If you lecture in maths and science, if you run a financial services company, that requires a sort of a maths brain, for want of a better word, a very organized brain, a strong degree of precision. And would you say that is what links your very varied career paths?
Well, some may call it attention deficit disorder. But, I want to take you back. Thanks for that quick overview of my career. And I really would like to greet all those on the platform. Since you're lawyers, I hope that you won't tell me everything I say will be held as evidence against me. But I want to take you back to where it all started. It started by having to deal with poverty, by having to survive in a system that has been militated to hold you back, to redefine you as children of some lesser god, and then having a mother who was a seamstress when she wasn't having children, and a dad who was a laborer at the Cape Town municipality, and very little material means. I guess that built the resilience. It built this intense desire to fix things and to make things. And slowly that translated through social consciousness that was raised at school, and a sense of service that was nurtured in church, from fixing things to fixing broken things in society. We have a society that is fractured, that is characterized by gross inequality, by poverty, by unemployment, if we just look at South Africa. But leadership dearth in public leadership is actually pathetic. There are few exemplars in public leaders. That is, the Afrikaans has a beautiful word. It says nastrevenswaardig, worthy of striving after. And I guess it is that foundation that was then supported by a scholarly approach in engineering, in mathematics and science, but also my first master's degree as a cognitive scientist. The thinking of thinking taught me that the people who make the most impact in life are not problem solvers per se, but those who know what problems matter and who have an intense desire to fix that problem even long before a solution becomes visible. It's grit, resilience, and that intense desire to fix things and make the world a better place.
Talking about fixing broken things, can we talk about when you took over as Commissioner of SARS in 2019? You inherited an institution which was deeply undermined by your predecessor, Tom Moyane. I think it's probably fair to say that morale at SARS was at an all-time low. The organization was dysfunctional. The Nugent report had been issued in 2018, And he said the conclusion we reach at the end of the inquiry is that there has been a massive failure of integrity and governance at SARS, and all else follows from that. That was one of the key conclusions of the Nugent inquiry. I think one of the miraculous things about your tenure at SARS is, how did you get this institution back on the right track? How did you transform the cultural and ethical center of the organization to what it is today? And how did you turn it around? Because, I think the story of a large number of South African institutions post the Zuma era is that they have never recovered. But you somehow managed to transform that organization and get it back on track. And what did you do to initiate that cultural and ethical shift in the organization?
Anthony, firstly, there was nothing miraculous about it. Miracles are things you cannot explain. We started this process and project of rebuilding SARS with a very, very clear strategic intent. But Nugent was absolutely right. The organization had been deliberately captured to serve a corrupt intent. Tried and tested organizational arrangements like the large and international business center, the high wealth center, the high risk unit that looked at criminal syndication, the high court litigation unit, the anti-corruption and integrity unit. These were important units that, when we were there in our first term at SARS, drew on international best practice of how well-run revenue authorities are organized. So why would a consulting company with a CEO or commissioner then break down what is tried and tested? Because SARS was not a poor-performing administration at the time. There can only be a corrupt intent, and that was clear. But the real damage to the organization was the trauma, the pain that was inflicted on good men and women of SARS, who had been career professional tax administrators, customs administrators, who had given their life to SARS, who deserved a better leadership. Many of them were marginalized. More than 2,000 of them left the organization, highly trained and specialist and experienced people. Those who stayed were marginalized. They were given little corners to go and sit in with no work. And so much hurt had taken place. So the first focus was not about technology, even though I'm a geek and I love playing around with technology and AI and processes. That wasn't the most important work. The most important work was regaining the trust of the men and women at SARS, starting a process of internal healing by listening, and then actively designing and implementing reparation programs that made people feel worthy, made people feel that they could do something meaningful and purposeful, and that they were heard, were seen, and that someone felt their pain, shared it, and responded to it. That was the real, what you call miracle, but that was the real intentional and deliberate transformation from the inside out, because it is at the level of DNA that sustainable organizations are built, not putting more lipstick or cosmetic on the surface, changing organizational structures or fixing policies or adding technology in a way that you don't really understand what purpose technology must serve. So it was from an inside out healing that we took place. The second big focus was taking head on the leadership residual from the era of capture. Many of the senior leaders were either captured themselves, they either became complicit in the project or just compliant. As many people do, they become compliant rather than sticking their head out. We had to deal with that head on. So in the first 3 to 4 months, We had serious conversations, one-on-one, and we took leave of about 6 senior leaders, and following that, a few more. But that sent a clear message out that we would not tolerate or stand for a leadership that was less than what true stewards of an organization that holds in trust the hopes, the fears, the material and emotional well-being of a nation, because that's what SARS really is. We were clear. To those who remained, I said, you are now here because I want to work with you, but things will change. Many of you have been placed in roles that were not suited to your background or your experience, so allow me to move you after observation. And so in parallel with that, we then started by giving a clear strategic intent. Our playbook is well recorded and discoverable for those who are interested. Our strategic playbook with a clear strategic intent, 9 enduring strategic objectives, a clear, inspirational and intimidating vision, because that's what great visions are. But then importantly, a plan of execution. In South Africa, we know we are great at planning. We have commissions and we have lots of processes and frameworks, and we announce many things, but we are very, very poor at execution. Now, in a world where the rate of change has become exponential, the inability to implement is going to leave us even further behind. And so that's then what started the actual practical things of how do we deploy technology? How do we use AI, because that was rapidly emerging? How do we rebuild and reskill people to serve the mandate? And so it was very structured, very intentional, and very well recorded. So definitely not a miracle, but an intentional, clear plan of institutional rebuilding from the inside out. I want to come back to leadership, because organizations, whether public or private, they stand or fall by the quality of leadership. And I'm clear that there are 5 things that we have to look for in any leader. The first is a person of good character. And this doesn't mean a perfect person. I am by no means a perfect person. I'm a flawed human being, a boy from the township, just every day getting up, trying to be the best version of himself. But a person of good character means that you have good intent. You put that good intent into practice, you build habits, and you never give up trying to make things better. That's what people of good character do. They don't want to go out and intentionally hurt others or destroy that which serves the greater social good. So that's what we need in leaders. And that's sorely lacking in both private and public sector often. But public sector, because it's so visible and its consequences so severe, is what hits us in the face every day. Private sector often gets away with poor leadership because they are not as visible as public sector leaders. The second quality for a good leader is the requirements for the job. If you ever got onto a plane and you hear a voice from the cockpit saying, "Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, this is Ed Kieswetter, your captain speaking," get off the plane. Ed Kieswetter do not have the experience to fly a plane or to do brain surgery. But I have a track record of fixing broken institutions, which is what you need. Does the individual candidate have the requirements for the job? And by that, I just mean the hard competence before you get to some of the more profound attributes which is captured in character. The third is a leader must have a track record of delivery. I think it was Jack Welch that says the best predictor of leadership is leadership. So give someone a popcorn stand and see how well they manage that. If they do that well, give them something more important, something bigger. Give them the corner shop to run. If they run that well, give them the district, give them the province, give them the national organization to run. And so that requires a very deliberate building of experience over successive years. You cannot have a 20-year experience over 5 weeks or 5 months. It takes 20 years to build 20 years of experience. So do the people come with a track record of delivery? The fourth criteria for leadership is that an ethic of hard work, something I learned from my dad, to have an absolutely unequaled ethic of hard work. I don't know of any CEO who has a 9-hour or 8-hour job. They work around the clock. It's literally a highly professional slave. And then the fifth.
Happy.
And then the fifth, an important criteria is a leader must be incorruptible, must not give in, must not yield to pursue their narrow interest at the expense of the greater good. And so it was that formula that we sought to build in leaders. We have a clear leadership model. It's also discoverable of what we expect in leaders, and it embraces these things. And we've nurtured that, we've developed that, which is also, I'm very proud that the incoming commissioner has been born and groomed and built through a very deliberate process. So that's what you refer to as the miracle.
Well, can I ask you a related question? You know, with my colleagues and I, just before we joined this call, we were reflecting on it in a way, that how lucky, in a sense, the country and SARS was to get somebody of your quality to run the organization. But this doesn't seem to happen very commonly in large public institutions in South Africa. I mean, the problems at Transnet and Eskom and the post office, you know, these are legion, and we are all very familiar with this. How does one attract good leadership into public organizations in South Africa? Because this really does seem to be a problem across the board. And as you've said, unfortunately, poor leadership often affects the most vulnerable members of our society, whether it's healthcare or education, etc. And we are so dependent on having good leadership in these public institutions, but invariably we seem to have very poor leadership. I mean, the Madlanga Commission of Inquiry is exposing all the problems in our police services. We've had historical problems in the National Prosecution Authority. How do we go about attracting a better quality of leadership into public institutions in South Africa? And do you have any thoughts in that regard?
You know, I think that firstly, one of the implicit objectives that we realized SARS would serve, even though that was not the initial plan, was to demonstrate, firstly, to other public institutions that it is possible to recover from state capture after being hollowed out. Secondly, it is possible to attract good people into the public sector. And so for us, and there are many learned men and women on this call, for us, SARS in a way is a proof of concept of how public service could be positioned. But there are a few things about public sector that makes it harder. The first is very often appointments in public sector are inspired by a political motive. Now, I'm not saying this is a good thing or a bad thing. Around the world, political parties choose their own. We've given it a bad name in South Africa. We call it cadre deployment. But there isn't a single, in South Africa, the largest parties being the ANC and the Democratic Alliance, they employ their own. And there's no reason why they should not, because you need to have those who sign up to your political agenda. The problem is not deploying people of one's own political organization. The problem is often making that the only criteria for appointment, and not those 5 things that I referred to earlier on of character, requirements for the job, track record of delivery, work ethic, and incorruptibility. And so very often people end up in positions, even if they are good people, even those who are not corrupt, that they are just not prepared for. And so that's the first thing we have to fix. Make sure we are clear about the kind of leaders, both attributes and skills, that every single department needs, and that requires an intentional plan of action to grow such kinds of leaders, because people often ask, are leaders born or groomed? Well, all leaders are born because by virtue of being a human being, but leadership is a skill that can be explicitly cultivated if provided that the basic character and attributes are there. So that's the first thing we have to do, because this becomes then a virtuous cycle that success breeds success. Good public organizations become attractive employers, and attractive employers draw good people. So there's no quick fix to this. The second thing is the governance environment wherein public sector organizations are expected to work. And I am sorry, I'm a critic of, I am absolutely, and we can demonstrate that SARS in every one of its 7 years have had an unqualified audit, clean audits. So we have demonstrated that you can run an effective organization and within the governance requirements. But I can tell you very often the governance requirements are onerous. They are compliance driven, not business driven. So it inadvertently does not reward success, it rewards compliance. No CEO in the public sector, whether a DG or a commissioner or a other leader, wants to be embarrassed in Parliament when you come there with a qualified audit or what is the thing called irregular or wasteful expenditure, because your scoreboard, your performance review is done in plain sight of everyone who has a television. So it's a huge burden, and so the best way to get a clean audit is to do nothing, because failure is not rewarded, it's punished. And so the culture in the public sector often does not breed excellence, breeds success, because very often success is not a function of a linear path of delivery. In fact, more and more, you need to fail fast, you need to experiment, you need to learn from failure and go forward. The public sector environment does not nurture that culture. It nurtures a culture of compliance, and compliance is about doing as little as you can to stay out of trouble. Thirdly, what is from SARS, what has benefited me is the following. One, the mandate of SARS is clearly expressed in law. There can be no doubt what SARS has been created for. I think that kind of clarity is sometimes lacking in other departments. Very often, ministerial portfolios are again created by trying to balance politics with governance. And so how many portfolios, how many ministries, how many departments you create is often not an expression of strategic thought of what needs to be delivered, but of trying to accommodate. We saw now with the GNU, we had an expanded cabinet because we now have more political agendas, a broadened political agenda. And I'm not saying that is a bad thing or a good thing, it's just the thing that you now have to find another minister, another deputy minister, so you have this growing, expansive organization of government, which are ineffective, not organized to win, and doesn't have the same clarity of legal prescription and mandate that organizations like SARS has. That was an important benefit that I had. There was secondly, a clear delineation between the minister and the commissioner. There is no encroachment. Obviously, it's up to the individuals to hold that line, but the law is clear about that. The mandate of the commissioner is clearly defined in law, and that helped. And the third thing I want to say that helped is SARS was taken out of the public service and created as a public sector institution that could set its own remuneration scales, its own condition of service. And sometimes that's a problem because there's jealousy, there's encroachment, there's an attempt to constrain that. But again, the incumbent must push that. So those are some of the things that makes it difficult for public sector organizations to succeed, but starts with clear leadership, clear roles and accountability, segregation between political and administrative roles, and then holding people accountable to deliver.
You've been in the top job at SARS for, I think, 6.5 years as commissioner.
7 years.
7 years. You're on the cusp of retirement. When you look back at your tenure at SARS, what would you regard as your most significant achievement as the head of the organization?
The people we leave behind. It was when I arrived at SARS, I knew that this was not going to be easy. I had read the Nugent report. I had watched the demise of SARS being broadcast as the rest of us did when we follow commissions of inquiry. So I didn't walk in thinking, oh, this is going to be slam dunk. They must be so lucky that they found me. I walked into the role with a great, firstly, an inordinate sense of privilege to be asked to do such an important work. And I don't think South Africa fully understands the compounding effect. We celebrate the 2 trillion, but it's actually the compounding effect on future generations when you have a well-functioning revenue authority. I said last night in a farewell function that was arranged for me that we have consistently, since COVID, grown 1.5 times faster than nominal GDP growth. And that's what we call tax buoyancy of 1.5. That amounts to over 800 billion rand. If we had to, as a counterfactual data point, ask what would have happened to our fiscal integrity if SARS had to grow with a buoyancy of 1. In other words, we expanded at the same rate as the economy. Well, that would have meant that instead of delivering 2 trillion in the final year and 11.8 trillion rand in the 7 years, which, by the way, is almost half of the total revenue SARS collected in its entire existence. It took us about 22 years to collect the first trillion, and then the second trillion in under 10 years. That's because of an efficient revenue administration functioning at 1.5 times growth on a compound annual growth basis. Had we grown at a unity buoyancy, we would have had to borrow in this period almost 900 billion rand more. That would have meant an additional 80 billion rand of additional debt service cost forever. If you think about what that does, it would have meant that our debt would have peaked at between 88 and 90% of GDP, and not where it is currently, just under 79%. If you think about the compounding effect on future generations, the debt we didn't have to borrow, the debt service cost we didn't have to incur, and redirect that 800 to 900 billion to public goods, that's the compounding effect of a well-functioning revenue authority. If you think of the VAT increase we didn't have to have, the average family spends 15,000 rand. A 2% VAT increase would have meant a further expenditure of 3,600 rand per family per year forever. For a family at 500,000 rand a year, that's 1,200 rand that they saved because of a well-functioning revenue authority. Between 0.8 and 1% compounding effect on inflation, higher debt service, higher borrowing cost for already struggling families. And all of that is embedded into the pricing structure of an economy and never comes out again. The 1% VAT increase that we had about 10 years ago will likely never come out of the system. So any tax increase is embedded into the pricing structure and therefore the burden of cost in future generations. So we don't understand that. So all of that is staggering if you think about it like I do through the numbers. But that's not the most important outcome. The most important outcome for me is we arrived with trust broken between the public and SARS and between a traumatized workforce that have lost hope and that have been hurt. For me, the greatest achievement of the 7 years is I leave with an institution that is resilient, that is healed internally, not perfect. We have many things that we want to do, but we have a clear blueprint of what the next 5 to 10 years would look like. We've launched Modernization 3.0, and we have people willing and able to do everything in their power because they have restored faith and trust. They have a clear sense of purpose, and they have direction that is unequivocal. So for me, the first greatest achievement is the people we leave behind will make this organization strong into the future. The second is the public trust was at 48%. To leave with public trust at 75% and a service level above 90%, voluntary compliance index up by 5 percentage points, which again, the compounding value of that is incalculable because it also takes burden of future taxpayers. For me, it is the re-establishment of integrity in the compact between SARS and the public and the internal resilience of the people that I leave with the greatest sense of humility and privileged sense that I have been able to lead this organization. That's what I will look back with a great sense of joy.
Your tenure in a way has come a little too soon, and I think the end of it has come a little too soon, should I say. And one of the big challenges that's still out there is the growth of the illicit economy. Particularly, I think what is very visible at the moment, and there are probably lots of things that are not visible to us, the public, but the ones that are visible are the growth of illegal tobacco sales, the growth of illegal alcohol sales, illegal fuel mixing, and a variety of other sort of what I would describe as illicit aspects of the unlawful economy. And I think, you know, some people estimate that the size of this illegal economy is almost somewhere in the region of 10 to 15% of GDP and growing. What do you think can be done to combat the growth of this illegal economy? And it seems to me that it's running a real risk of depriving the fiscus of tax revenue, apart from, you know, all the other risks that it poses from a law enforcement point of view. What are your thoughts about what should be done to combat the growth of this illicit economy, and what should government be doing about this?
Well, I think that's an important question. And one of the important things for making meaningful change is framing the question correctly, because we often come up with perfect solutions to badly framed questions. So one of the things I have considered and thought about deeply from the time I came back, and in fact, I made this proposal earlier on, but it didn't really find traction, as often is the case. You have to, constant dripping wears the stone. But I never gave up on it. And finally, I think in the last few months, I've been able to influence the way of thinking of how we should address the illicit economy. So here's the problem. Firstly, the illicit economy may be illicit, but it is highly organized. It is well functioning. It acts and performs and behaves like a business, except for the fact that it operates outside of the law in many ways. It's a deeply embedded systemic phenomena. We have up until now as government responded to it in a transactional and functional way, not in a systemic way. What do I mean by that? SARS within its mandate must deal with the illicit economy because its mandate requires us to do that. Secondly, the police must deal with the illicit economy. They enforce laws. The Border Management Agency has been created to ensure that the flow of people across our borders, that those who are undocumented, those who are criminals, are detected. The Defence Force guards our borderline. The NPA prosecutes. The SIU, by proclamation, investigates. The hawks within the police, priority crimes. All necessary functions, but each operating in its narrow silo. That means we lack a systemic, unified approach to dealing with this problem. It's called these vertical silos that function to its narrow mandate without understanding the broader objective. So I have been working hard to create a business case that we need to do it differently. And so thankfully, we've been able to share with the President a new approach. You would have heard an announcement in his Sonar address that speaks to disrupting the illicit economy. So we are engaged in designing a national illicit economy disruption program, taking each of these value chains, understanding its interconnectedness, because often these value chains are also fronts for money laundering, illicit financial flows. Terror financing can very easily come out of that. I'm not saying that's the case in South Africa, but very often we don't know where the money ends up and what it funds. So that's the first issue. President then agreed that this program will be located in the presidency because the president is the only authority in state that can command across ministries and create a national agenda with national KPIs, if I can call it that bluntly, of what winning looks like. Very often within our narrow silos, we also have perverse incentives that may tick our APP because we have APPs in Parliament, but it does nothing to move the dial on the actual phenomena. The second was to suggest that to start with the illicit economy, we have to begin to fix our borders. And so we have proposed that we start by fixing the Lebombo border post and the borderline between South Africa and Mozambique, because borders are the weak points through which illicit goods and travelers cross, and also often the weak point for trade-based money laundering to be practiced. And we want to use Lebombo because it's the highest risk port, but also, given the borderline, a manageable chunk of borderline. And by the way, the lion and the cheetahs on the Kruger National Park is an important mitigation for that borderline. So it's a manageable piece of work. If we fix that, we address the most and the highest risk. But that what it does, it then gives us a proof of concept of what a smart, intelligent, modern border port should look like, where there's less discretion on people. It is intelligence-led. We've broken down the silos between these departments. We've managed the borderline and the border port as a system where each of these functions work off a shared intelligence dashboard and under a single operating command platform. That's the vision that we've led. We've begun working with these departments. The Minister of Finance has agreed that he would support this as a whole of government program and not a disaggregated or fragmented program in each. So what we have typically done in the past is we give the BMA 100 million for capital expenditure and modernization. We give SARS 100 million for border modernization. We give the police and we give SNDF. And each of us go away, and the police, they want to do drones because it's nice and sexy to also have drones. The BMA may want to improve the offices environment and invest a little bit in technology. SARS wants to invest in smart modern borders, which is largely intelligence and AI driven. The Defense Force may want to go and have a big party in Toyandu, I don't know. And so each of us go off and we spend our money differently, but we don't fix anything. So the proposal is, let's fix something so that we can look for a return on our investment in one thing that is finite, in scope, in cost, and we can deliver it, and we know what winning looks like. So over the next 3 years, we hope to drive this program, the border reform at Lubombo, use it as a proof of concept for how borders should be modernized in the future, how our border lines should be managed, scale that up across all of our borders and different modalities, whether it's land borders, sea borders, or air border, land borders, seaports, or airports. And then also, whilst doing that, begin to identify each of these value chains of alcohol, tobacco, clothing, fuel. These are high-risk value chains that are often used to perpetrate crime, and to drive that and make it harder for them to function by first cutting off the flow across our borders, containing the problem in South Africa, and then systematically dismantling it. We've seen some of the success in SARS, but alone we can't do it. So it's a very different way of conceptualizing it, of framing the problem, and then building a program of action to execute that.
Commissioner, I know my colleagues are eager to jump in, and I've been hogging the conversation. So I'm going to hand over to Marilla Govender, and she's going to take over from me now. Thank you.
Thanks, Anthony. Commissioner, I think let's continue around that vein, because you contextualized that 200 trillion net revenue collection for 2026, which really is historic, and it was interesting to also see you put it in historical context as well. But at the same time, you mentioned that there is a 500 billion rand tax gap. If you were to rank it, where do you see, or what are the principal drivers of that tax gap? Because we just spoke about the illicit economy, but is it on the VAT side? Is it on the personal income tax side? Is it in the corporate income tax side? Where do you see that principal driver coming from?
So remember that 500 billion is a moving target. But from our last research, including work done by the Davis Tax Commission, our own work with international research partners and within SARS, about 40% of that gap is from VAT. VAT is a high-risk tax for a number of reasons. It's self-administered, and unless you are instrumented into the economy at every point of sale across the entire value chain, you are reliant on disclosures by taxpayers. Now, the minute you are reliant on information from a person who has a vested interest to engineer the information in a way that gives them the best outcome, you find a whole lot of areas of abuse that takes place. So the creation of fictitious invoices, setting up of businesses with no intention to trade. You'll register a business, and as all of you know, your first 6 to 9 months, depending on the kind of business, you will have input VAT claims, but you're not trading. because you're building your store, your business, you're buying capital equipment, you're buying stock. All of that incurs a VAT input cost that in law you're entitled to claim. When a few months later, because you never had an intention to trade, you collapse the business, you deregister it, you declare bankruptcy, or somehow we call it the Phoenix syndrome. The business dies and it reappears in another legal form, because we also have this unhelpful reality of buying off-the-shelf companies that are already registered. So some of the areas that has to be addressed. So VAT is the most is the largest area of risk and of abuse. We find people registering as you know, who are below the 1 million, and now of course the threshold has been moved to 2.3. But we find people registering because, and they don't have to, and we ask why. And often when you look through that, we see the same cell phone number on about 10 registrations. We see the same physical address on across, you know, a number. So the areas of abuse for VAT is the biggest one, about 40%, or if you use the 500 billion as a number, about 200 billion just from that. About another 60 billion from customs fraud, you know, a similar amount from trade-based money laundering, which involves a lot of customs fraud. So from excise and customs, probably collectively about another 120 billion. And then the actual phenomena that I think we often escape is that normal people who have one job, one salary, payroll administered, is our lowest risk, because we have access to third-party information through the payrolls, through the medical schemes, through the pension funds, through the banks, which is why 6 million taxpayers of our 8 million individuals didn't have to file a return, because we have disintermediated the need for them to disclose anything, because we obtain the information from verifiable sources. We then impose you know, our computational powers. We run it through our risk engines, all of which are AI algorithm driven, and we come out with a assessment that we present to taxpayers. By the way, our acceptance rate is 99%. The 1% who decide to edit will be those who may have travel logs, those who claim things that may not be you know, recorded on a third-party database like solar panels, when you know, when people were allowed to claim that, we would not have had a reliable third-party base. So modernizing our entire system to disintermediate continuously the need for people to disclose, for us to be instrumented into the natural systems of businesses, to be connected to every point of sale, is the ultimate cure, where no disclosures are necessary. And we think that's achievable. Nowhere in the world for VAT have that been achieved, but we did it for personal income tax, and our compliance levels for personal income tax is very high. For individuals, for standard income tax, wealthy people, large businesses still have arbitrage opportunities, often helped by expensive lawyers and accountants and tax practitioners, unfortunately, which is a conversation for another day. But so you'll see in our modernization a significant focus on customs modernization, and on VAT modernization will take place. But this is not just about dumping technology on a poorly defined problem. It's about understanding the deep system into which we have to instrument and embed ourselves, and then the AI that we have to deploy on that. The intent is always to make it easier for taxpayers to fulfill those obligations. An attendant benefit is to detect and respond to risks. So when I say to you, the 6 million people who have been auto-assessed had to do nothing, that's a service to them. The fact that they're able to have their refunds in under 72 hours is a service to them. The fact that those who do submit a return receive an assessment outcome in under 5 seconds is a service to them. The quid pro quo benefit for the fiscus is the same technology and AI has also delivered 300 billion rand of additional revenue by detecting impermissible or fraudulent refunds, by helping us identify mismatches between what people declare and what they actually have, and slowly but surely building and increasingly the capability to detect and respond to unexplained wealth.
And you've actually segued into something that I wanted to, in fact, raise with you. And you mentioned that you're a geek and you love playing with technology. And you have that memorable phrase that your vision is tax just happens. And I think you've kind of articulated that a little bit now. Could you kind of elaborate on what you see the role of AI and data science as assisting in transforming tax administration? Give us some of your thoughts about that vision for SARS into the future.
Well, I mean, SARS is just a business, an operation, highly complex, multi-product, multi-dimensional business like any other business. So AI does not present a lesser risk or a lesser opportunity than it does for all of you. But here's what we have to understand, that 5 years ago, we didn't use words like ChatGPT and Grok and these things because it didn't even exist. Today, agentic AI, and soon, in the next 3 to 5 years, my own prediction is artificial general intelligence will fundamentally transform not just the world of work, but the world as we know it. Here's why. Every cognitive task that human beings do now, whether you're a lawyer, an accountant, a programmer, an engineer, whatever requires you to have mastered a narrow subject specialization, you will not be able to compete with a equivalent AI agent. I'm already building such agents for myself, and we've done so for SARS. We have, if you go onto our Mobi app, we have built a tax advisor for you. It's not an FAQ, it's a GPT model. You can ask it any question, it will answer you. Initially quite funny, tax practitioners came to us and said we are threatening their livelihood. We have now fondly learned that they use our AI when taxpayers come to them for advice. None of us are going to be spared. So if your stock trade is a narrow subject specialization, you and I have been trained to solve narrow problems. In the next 3 years, we will build AI agents to be better than the best lawyer, better than the best engineer, in fact, better than collectively all engineers and all lawyers put together in one agent. And once you've built one agent, you can scale it up and build millions because you've built the prototype. What does that mean for us who have been rooted in problem solving, whether it's a legal problem, a medical problem, a science problem? We're going to have to reinvent ourselves. So we are aware of that. 6 years ago, we went to the trade unions, 7 years ago, and we said, this is coming. It's unstoppable. I have 2 choices. Either in 5 years' time, I will announce a retrenchment program of 1,000 people, or you work with me and we reskill our people to make them AI literate and to make them understand that the future to coexist with AI is what lies before us, and we don't have to fear it. And our staff, all of our staff will tell you they love AI. We've given everyone a co-pilot license, if I can do a bit of a marketing slot here for Microsoft, because we wanted them not to be intimidated by it. and to start playing around with it. And they'll tell you now how they love and how this has increased their productivity. We said we'd be ethical, we build guardrails, you disclose it, but we want you to use it. Increasingly, the routine work are being taken over, and we've built a proof of concept for a completely agentic contact center, where eventually human beings will be the irreducible minimum when 99% of contact center calls have been dealt with through the voice channel that is manned by as many agentic AI contact centers that we want to deploy. Verification. If you think about verification, anything that can be scripted, any task around which you can write an algorithm predictably. So what is verification? Verification is about matching what you have declared or what we know about it and comparing that with what we need to give a tax outcome, and where there's a gap, to find the information, to fill the gap and to close it, either to permit a refund, to raise an additional assessment, or to square off and reconcile an account. So progressively, we are building agents to do some of these routine tasks. So what do we do with people? Well, firstly, there are certain tasks that we believe makes human beings will be irreplaceable. Judgment, for example, and discretion, problem posing, curiosity, professional skepticism, empathy, stewardship. These are attributes that AI will maybe in the future can mimic. An AI can pretend that he or she loves you, but it will not be genuine. And human beings have this innate ability to ultimately detect. And so for us, with this in mind, we are embracing AI, but with a clear sense of purpose that we will deploy AI, we will do so responsibly, we will do so safely, we'll build the guardrails, we will trial and error, we'll fail, we'll fall, but we know what purpose AI must serve. It ultimately must do three things for us. One, it must help taxpayers understand their obligations unambiguously. Two, it must make the fulfillment of those obligations seamless and eventually intuitive and invisible. Tax just happens. And thirdly, it must detect and prevent any attempt to defraud the fiscus. Those are the three strategic objectives that AI must lead for us. It can serve no other purpose. Ultimately, we don't want tax to be a thing in anyone's life.
Commissioner, I'm mindful of time, and I know my colleague would want to slip in a question or two. Obvious, do you have a sort of roundup question, Commissioner?
Yeah, I do. Thanks, Marilla. I think, Commissioner Kieswetter, thank you so much for this discussion. I think a lot of the views that you've shared with us are very, very insightful. And I also think that you're uniquely positioned to reflect on the fragility of some of the institutions we have, and how those institutions can be threatened. And in particular, I think back to what you achieved pre-2010 at SARS, and then what happened after that. And then the question for me is, when you returned to SARS, what did you actually find, and how do we ensure that that isn't repeated in future?
You know, let me try and answer that question, because some of it I've responded to early on, the trauma, the distrust, the hurt that was discovered. But what is not recorded in the Nugent Commission is that the failure of SARS was actually stemmed because of the institutional resilience that we built in it before 2010. The good men and women that were there that developed an underground SARS, that's how they worked it. They went underground to continue to do their work, and to do so legally, but they had to survive. And because they loved the organization, they could see what was happening. And for me, I do the following analogy, obvious, that when we live in this world, we cannot ever wish for a germ-free world, right? There's always going to be germs. What we have to do is inoculate ourselves against those that could kill us. We all are vaccinated against COVID, or most of us. Or we must increase our general immunity. We immunize ourselves against germs. And institutional rebuilding requires a deep understanding of how do you strengthen the immune system of an organization so that it can withstand, because there will always be corruption. There will always be leaders who serve their narrow intent, poor leaders, managers who do not have empathy for staff. You can't engineer that out of people, because people are, whilst it is our most ingenious resource in every organization, it is also our most fallible risk, our most fatal flaw. So if you accept that, you ask, what is the DNA that you can edit in the organization? How do you re-inculcate a culture? And what we've done, we lead by, we say the law tells us what we do, the Administration Act tells us how we do it, but we have chosen why we do it. And so a strong narrative within SARS, whether you speak to a frontline service consultant, to an auditor, an executive, they will tell you what our higher purpose is. That we exist to enable government to build a capable state that ultimately serves the well-being of its people. And so it is our purpose that is deep in the core of our DNA. Then a code of conduct. What becomes our values that are non-negotiable? Taxpayer confidentiality, an incontestable commitment, a absolute commitment to data as incontestable proof for everything that we do. So those are some of the values that we inculcate. And ultimately, you find that good people will stay, and people who have, like nature, it says the ocean ultimately rejects everything that doesn't belong in it. Great organizations that are resilient will attract people who share that and ultimately reject people who don't. So for me, no amount of law, policies, regulation, governance structures can stand against human failure and corrupt leadership. And we saw that happen and still happening. And so for me, it is building that immunization, building deep, improving the level of immunity within an organization by strengthening from the inside out.
And then lastly, I think next week, Thursday, is your last day, the 30th of April. You leave behind at SARS 14,000 staff, or over 14,000 staff that you've led for the last 7 years. Dr. Makubu is taking over and he'll be stepping into your shoes. I guess, what parting message do you have for the staff that you leave behind and for the incoming commissioner?
I have spent the last 3 weeks going around the country talking to our staff and thanking them for the work they've done, but also reminding them that they are the true legacy I leave behind. And the trust that, when I say to South Africans, trust has increased, I'm talking about our staff. When I say service have increased, I'm talking about them. So I have ensured that the praise, the tributes, the recognition that have been directed towards me, I've made sure that they understand that I just represent them. And that when I leave, the burden of this praise, the burden of this recognition, the achievement is what they own, what they must honor and live up to. And I can tell you with a great degree of confidence, that's what I know I will leave behind when I walk out next Thursday.
Commissioner Kieswetter, thank you so much for your time this morning with us. We really do appreciate it. It's been a great privilege talking to you. And I know it sounds like something of a cliche, but thank you for your service to the country. I think you've done immeasurable things to help us going forward. And we really appreciate your time this morning. Thank you.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you, Anthony.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Thank you.